As the weathered naval launch had laboured its way across the harbour towards the waiting ship, Lieutenant Shepherd had found himself reflecting on the fact that his new posting could never be described as a handsome vessel. But then, she had not been chosen because of her good looks. At the time of her construction, she had been christened the Mabel, in reference to a youthful romance on the part of her owner. But after 20 years spent hauling cod and haddock from the waters around Fraserburgh, the ageing trawler had now begun a new life as HMS Mendacious. The battered fishing vessel had been completely stripped out, before being refurbished as one of a new generation of Q-ships. These specialised craft were now being redeployed for the first time since the Great War, in response to the growing threat of German submarine attacks around the shores of Great Britain. Under orders to drift along the coastline while simulating an engine malfunction, Q-ships were designed to draw in inquisitive U-boats. But whilst they outwardly presented the perfect target for a German submarine commander, in reality, these prey were quite the predator. Although Mendacious resembled many other local fishing craft, she possessed firepower comparable to that of an infantry company. Hidden beneath her deck on concealed platforms were a number of retractable 4-inch naval guns, 20mm Oerlikon cannons, and a pair of concealed torpedo launchers mounted either side of her hull. But it was the devices hidden away at her stern that made Mendacious such a potent threat. Concealed beneath removable wooden panelling were 2 experimental Fairley mortars, on loan from the Vickers Armstrong Weapons Company. Each could launch 10 high-explosive projectiles into the waters surrounding the ship, sending any enemy submarine straight down to the seabed below. The crew were a mixed bunch, largely naval regulars like Shepherd himself, but it had been necessary to supplement them with reservists. There were also several local sailors who had signed up to serve in her for their own personal reasons, and it was the presence of this particular group that had necessitated the lieutenant's urgent reassignment. Prior to the commencement of hostilities, Hugh Lennox had been a prominent figure in the local community and the owner of a sizable fishing company. With the war's arrival, he had ordered his employees to assist the Royal Navy wherever possible by carrying out aggressive manoeuvres against any enemy vessels they may encounter. Several weeks later, one of his trawlers was destroyed by a U-boat it had attempted to ram, with Lennox's nephew amongst the fatalities. The businessman spent the subsequent months pivoting between grief and rage before learning of the proposed construction of the Q-ships in the Aberdeen boatyards. Faced with a chronic shortage of men and resources, the Admiralty could little afford to turn down an offer of substantial financial and logistical assistance, the only caveat being that Lennox himself would be commissioned to command the Mendacious. But events would soon transpire that caused him to rethink this arrangement. During his first patrol, Lennox had encountered a life raft containing the flight crew of a Heinkel bomber, downed whilst conducting an air raid over Peterhead. Upon returning to Fraserburgh, his men had subsequently unloaded the bullet-riddled bodies of 2 German airmen, which had then been taken to a local churchyard for burial. There had followed no small amount of debate amongst the town's hostelries and public houses as to whether the rounds that had killed the Germans had been fired before or after the arrival of the British vessel. In time, these discussions had naturally made their way back to Rosyth Naval Base, generating no small degree of consternation. Keen to avoid a scandal in relieving Lennox of his command, Vice Admiral Sir Charles Ramsay had instead requested an experienced first officer be found to rein in his nonconformist commander. Having only recently recovered from injuries sustained during the Battle of Narvik, Stanley Shepherd now found himself overqualified for such a task. Hauling himself up onto the deck of the ship, Lieutenant Shepherd soon found that the morale of his new crew was just as fractured as he had feared. And whilst it was clear that his arrival was welcomed by the majority of the sailors on board the ship, to Lennox and his small band of supporters, Shepherd was an unwanted inconvenience. Despite maintaining the pretense of civility as he had handed over a tumbler of scotch, Commander Lennox had gone to great pains to point out how smoothly things were running, emphasising a fervent desire for his new first officer not to alter any of the working practices established prior to his arrival. For his part, Stanley Shepherd was an experienced naval officer, having faced the enemy under fire and endured the tragic loss of men serving under his command. But he was neither aggressive or antagonistic in nature. Slightly rattled by this confrontational introduction, he immediately sought to diffuse the conversation. But it soon became apparent there was little way of endearing himself to the irritable Scotsman, and attempts at flattery were instead misconstrued as an attempt to patronise. The meeting deteriorated rapidly, with Lennox becoming increasingly hostile, forcing his new subordinate to defend himself using naval regulations. The argument ended with Shepherd ordered to ready the boat for the evening's patrol, before being curtly dismissed from the commander's cabin. He had spent the next few hours quietly sounding out his fellow officers, gauging who he could trust and who would be better relegated to tasks situated away from the rest of the crew. As a full moon hung low overhead, the boat's engines were duly idled. A party of sailors were then dispatched to the deck, where the running lights illuminated them as they appeared to be fixing an imaginary malfunction. This charade continued for the next 90 minutes, whilst the gun crews waited patiently below decks. Eventually, this tense silence was broken by the sound of an unexpected cry from the bow of the ship. Shepherd found himself automatically rising to his feet as the gunners began to ready their weapons around him. A smothering air of anxiety now descended, and they all listened intently to the heavy footfalls that could now be heard hurrying from one end of the ship to the other. A heated discussion was clearly taking place above them, before the sounds of a rope being thrown, followed by what appeared to be people scrambling up over the side of the boat. A few minutes later, 3 bedraggled figures were ushered below decks at gunpoint. Their sodden coveralls were innocuous enough, but the white cap worn by their leader immediately identified the newcomers as German submariners, evidently as surprised by the encounter as their Royal Navy counterparts. Their officer was duly taken by Shepherd to meet with Lennox, whilst his 2 enlisted men were pushed further down into the depths of the boat. As he sipped some scotch, Captain Lieutenant Ernst Kohler had regarded his captors with caution, grudgingly congratulating them on the sinking of his vessel. But on realising his compliment had been met with confusion on the part of the English officers, he set his glass to one side, a look of grim realisation falling across his features. A few minutes passed before Kohler spoke again. He advised the British commanders their ship was in great danger, and they should leave the area as a matter of urgency. This suggestion immediately enraged Lennox, who took the pronouncement as a threat. He immediately exploded at his prisoner, in turn generating a further period of awkward silence. When Shepherd spoke, it was in a calm and measured way, assuring Kohler that the Mendacious and her crew had no knowledge of his situation prior to their arrival, and asking for the captain to explain himself. With Lennox silently seething off to one side, Kohler had agreed, before explaining at length what had transpired. U-25 had departed Wilhelmshaven several days previously, making her way up into the North Sea in search of Allied shipping. For 48 hours they had failed to locate anything of interest, and as darkness had fallen, Kohler had ordered the submarine up onto the surface in order to recharge her batteries. Standing up on the conning tower alongside the lookouts, Kohler had been struck by how quiet and calm the ocean was around them. This stillness was suddenly shattered by a violent shift in the stability of the boat, and the sounds of panic shouting emanating up from deep inside her hull. As he had gone to climb back down the ladder, the sub had again lurched unexpectedly to one side, a torrent of water hurtling through the command room beneath him. From fore and aft, he could see crewmen scrambling over one another to escape, screaming that something was cutting through the hull at either side of the boat. Realising his ship was already doomed, the young officer had scrambled back up the metal rungs, only just managing to throw himself clear as the top of the conning tower had disappeared under the water's surface behind him. Other than the 2 lookouts, nobody escaped. The survivors had clung to one another for what seemed an eternity, drifting in the water until they had become aware of a ship a short distance away. But their initial elation at being saved had been short-lived, and as they had been taken into captivity, Kohler and his men had convinced themselves they were the victims of some new British wonder weapon. With the interview concluded, the German officer was duly removed to join his detained comrades, leaving the executive officers of the Mendacious to consider his story. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Lennox was quick to write the loss of the U-boat off to the poor handling of its crew, but the detailed manner in which Kohler had presented his testimony unnerved Shepherd. Both men did, however, find themselves in agreement that Mendacious should conclude her patrol and return to Fraserburgh. The crew were to remain at their stations in case of any further unexpected encounters, with radio silence maintained in order to preserve the ship's identity. Barely had these orders been carried out than there was further commotion up on deck. Hurrying outside, the two officers found men congregating around the bow area, talking excitedly. Lennox demanded to know what was amiss, angry at this apparent lack of discipline. As he did so, his attention was drawn to what appeared to be a number of explosions on the far horizon, followed by red flares. It seemed that their patrol would not be concluding quite as early as they had anticipated. HMS Warsaw had always been considered something of an unlucky vessel. Built during the dying days of the Great War, she had not deployed operation until May of 1918, the conflict ending only months later. After a collision with a passenger ferry, she had been relegated to acting as a tender at the Navy's torpedo school, only reactivated from the reserve list with the outbreak of hostilities. As the men of the Mendacious gazed upon her now, they had little reason to question the shipyard stories that had labelled the aging destroyer as a cursed ship. The fires that were burning on her superstructure cast haunting shadows across the deck, which had slipped down low, close to the water's surface, stubbornly refusing to disappear into the depths. Save for smoke curling out of the gaping holes that had been blown into her hull, there was no movement, and no reply to the hailing blast offered by the trawler's horn. Barking orders at the sailors in order to shake them from their stupor, Shepherd began to form a boarding party, advising the nominated men to arm themselves accordingly. Doing so, he turned to look at Lennox, curious as to how his commander would react to him taking the initiative. The inquiring gaze was met with a grudging nod of approval. Shepherd found himself wondering if the Scot was merely eager to get him off the Mendacious, or had come to the realisation that by now he was somewhat out of his depth. The 6 men who joined the lieutenant in the ship's launch were all Navy regulars, a petty officer by the name of Harrison and 5 of the ship's ratings. They had armed themselves with Thompsons and a pair of the new Sten submachine guns, complemented by knives and cudgels that would never have been allowed aboard a conventional Navy ship. Boarding at the point where the wounded warship's deck lay lowest to the water, the group slowly fanned out, guns up and at the ready. Back aboard the Mendacious, their progress was followed intently by Lennox and the rest of the crew, all nervously scanning the stricken destroyer for signs of who or what may have been responsible. Their comrades watched on as the boarding party methodically satisfied themselves that the upper areas of the ship were clear, before disappearing from view into the interior of the Warsaw. Shepherd and his band had not ventured far along the maze of corridors and hatchways before they located the first few members of the ship's crew. Lying on the deck before them, cast in the dim emergency lighting that shone down from above, were 4 bodies. Motioning for Harrison and another of the sailors to investigate them, Shepherd raised his weapon and aimed it along the depths of the darkened metal corridor. When the petty officer rose to his feet moments later, he wore a haunted expression. The 4 men were dead, the gaping wounds they had sustained too deep to be the result of gunfire, and yet too uniform to have been caused by any explosion. As the small group continued further into the bowels of the Warsaw, they found more bodies, sometimes lying alone, other times in 2s or 3s, but all defenceless, having been dispatched in the same brutal manner. They were nearing the engine room when the smothering silence that surrounded them was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. Somebody was heading towards them at no small amount of speed. Barely had they managed to fan out into semi-defensive positions when a youth, wearing the insignia of a telegraphist, came herring out of the waiting darkness. Tumbling to the cold metal flooring amidst their number, the young radio operator pleaded for help, his eyes darting nervously back into the murky blackness he had just emerged from. Harrison had started to lean down to help the youth when he had paused unexpectedly, detecting the sound of much heavier footfalls approaching their position. Still whimpering in fear, the youth had scrambled past the Mendacious crew members before they could stop him, continuing on his desperate dash up towards the ship's deck. His retreating footsteps were now drowned out by others that were far more oppressive and monotonous in nature, steadily advancing upon the men from the direction the boy had just appeared. A looming shape emerged from the shadows, halting the instant it spied the boarding party. For a moment, the newcomer stood silently regarding the submachine guns that was trained on it, but whatever apprehension this individual felt paled into insignificance compared to the bewilderment its unexpected appearance had caused amongst the waiting British sailors. The figure's bulky clothing was similar to the suits worn by deep-sea divers, but was adorned with symbols and glyphs the likes of which the Englishman had never seen. Its exterior was covered in thick plating, similar in appearance to an Arthurian knight, but the armour's medieval nature bore stark contrast to a maddening array of valves and pipes overlaying its surface. In one hand, the intruder brandished a pronged spear, similar to those used by ancient gladiators. Shepard had been focused intently on the solid metal faceplate that obscured the figure's features, when the aforementioned trident was suddenly drawn back and hurled towards them with lightning speed. It buried itself directly into the chest of the sailor standing immediately to his left, the force of the impact lifting the man up off the ground and sending him skittling backwards. In an instant, the spearman theatrically snapped back his throwing arm, the javelin now inexplicably detaching itself from the lifeless victim and flying back along the corridor into his waiting gauntlet. But before the murderous weapon could be thrown again, the guns that had been levelled at its owner replied, peppering it with bullets. Round after round hammered into the surface of the attacker's suit, the force of each impact slowly causing him to retreat a short distance. Under this steady hail of gunfire, their assailant again managed to cast the trident in the direction of the sailors, but the relentless barrage had clearly affected its aim, the spear this time embedding itself in a bulkhead just short of the Mendacious crewmen. In a heartbeat, Shepard had stepped forward, smashing the weapon to the floor with the butt of his rifle before slamming a boot down onto its hilt and again firing upon the stranger. But despite having sustained a murderous number of hits, their opponent still stood. It slowly started to advance towards the British crewman, left hand outstretched. Shepard could feel the heavy metal weapon vibrating under his foot, trying to work itself free. He swore sharply, and then emptied the remainder of his magazine directly into the face of his oncoming attacker. One of Shepard's bullets tore straight through a collection of thick pipes, which snaked up under the chin of the intruder's face guard, creating an instant and catastrophic reaction. A clear fluid immediately started to spray outwards in all directions, and the suit's owner emitted a burbling and guttural scream. It reeled backwards and fell heavily to the floor, clutching desperately at the severed piping before becoming motionless. The echoing roar of the gunfire ceased, and for a time, the sailors of the Mendacious stood, staring cautiously at the downed warrior, searching for any sign of life. As the men around him hurried to reload their weapons, Harrison stepped forward, shouldering his weapon and unsheathing a lengthy bayonet from his belt. He walked with purpose directly to the prone figure, before driving the blade directly up and under the gap beneath its helmet and chestplate. The figure remained motionless, a thick and foul-smelling substance slowly pouring forth from where the blade had entered, pooling on the metal floor beneath it. Shepard moved up to join his subordinate, running a gloved finger through the clear liquid that was still spurting out from the armour's severed piping. He could detect the familiar briny scent of seawater, and was cautiously reaching down to remove the faceplate when the sound of further heavy footfalls echoed forth from the nearby darkness. Shepard yelled at the party to fall back down the corridor, pausing to confirm that his fallen sailor was beyond help. As he did so, one of the men removed something from his jacket pocket and hurled it along the passageway into the waiting darkness. In the fleeting moment that the grenade detonated, the lieutenant glimpsed two more armoured figures, stumbling backwards, caught in the blast. Shouting at his men, the officer began to hurry them back up towards the upper levels. There was a deafening clang, and Shepard turned to see another trident buried in the floor where he had been standing only moments before. It promptly detached itself and disappeared directly off, back into the darkness. He knew they had to get back to the Mendacious. This was a battle they could not win. The struggling and desperate sailors stumbled out onto the deck of the destroyer, still illuminated by the flames of the damage that had previously been torn into her superstructure. Hearing further gunfire, Shepard yelled at his men to cease fire, only to realise the sound was not in fact coming from the boarding party. Off to their left-hand side, several hundred feet away from the Warsaw, their own ship was fighting to save its life. Lennox stood at the bow of the Mendacious, nervously scanning the deck of the burning warship with his binoculars. Despite his confident assertion to the rest of the crew that it was most likely the catastrophic damage had been caused by the captured Germans, deep down he was as concerned as Shepard had been by Captain Kohler's tale. Once the boarding party had disappeared from view, he had ordered the ship's concealed weaponry to be raised. The gun crews now sat openly at their posts, silently scanning the waters that surrounded them. Whatever his shortcomings, Hugh Lennox was fiercely defensive of his command, determined that Mendacious would not suffer the same fate as the other two vessels they had now encountered. 2 decks below, Commander Kohler and his men sat with their backs to some wooden ammunition crates, staring despondently at the ropes tied around their hands. Their guard was a cheerless fellow who had stubbornly ignored any attempts at conversation. Still, at least for them the war was over. The peace and tranquility of captivity in England now beckoned. Without warning, a slicing jet of water suddenly sprung from the bow bulkhead, sending the freezing sea flooding into the small room. The sentry cried out in surprise, levelling his sidearm at the prisoners, who immediately outstretched their hands in alarm, assuring him the damage was not their doing. As the hole in the hull steadily expanded, more and more water began to flood in. The Germans found themselves being herded out of the room by a panicked crewman, who slammed the watertight door shut behind them. This commotion brought Lennox running, only for him to be stopped in his tracks by similar panicked cries coming from the stern. Several men materialised, claiming that something had sliced into the rear of the hull, saturating the stern compartment with seawater before they had managed to seal the room shut. The commander grimaced, his eyes turning to meet the knowing gaze of his German counterpart. Ordering his men to cut the ties around the hands of the prisoners, Lennox opened a storage locker and removed 3 pistols before carrying them across to the waiting submariners. He handed them to Kohler, who accepted the weapons with a slow nod. The 2 officers remained silent for a time, an unspoken bond forming between them, before the German asked where Lennox would like him and his men to stand. It was a brief and surreal moment of calm, but was not to last, as the ship's 4-inch guns unexpectedly opened fire above them. The vibrations caused the hull to rock wildly from side to side, sending the men below deck staggering to find stability. Lennox led the others up through the insides of the boat, just in time to see a gunner scream out in agony, falling from his post with what appeared to be a long metal javelin jutting from the centre of his spine. Lennox watched on in horror as the spear inexplicably extracted itself from the prone sailor and hurtled back across the deck along the opposite trajectory it had just travelled. It landed comfortably in the gauntlet of a bulky figure dressed in some kind of battle armour, before the intruder was sent skittling over the side of the ship by a burst of heavy machine gun fire. All around Lennox, identical figures in ornately armoured diving gear were hauling themselves up onto the deck, hurling savage-looking harpoons and spears at the ship's gunners. With a roar of anger, the commander emptied the contents of his revolver into the direction of the nearest intruder, sending it tumbling back into the waiting darkness. But no matter how many of the attackers were felled, it soon became clear the crew of the Mendacious were fighting what appeared to be a losing battle. One of the German sailors let out a pained cry and suddenly span sideways over the side of the ship, a long metal harpoon jutting out from a bloodied wound underneath one of his armpits. His colleague unleashed a series of oaths in his native tongue, snatching up a submachine gun that lay discarded on the deck and firing off a burst at his compatriot's killer before he too was slain. With Kohler by his side, Lennox continued his way across the deck of the ship towards the stern, reloading his pistol as he did so. The gunfire around them was lessening now, with few of the gunners left standing, but there was a new sound to replace it, a deep thrumming noise that permeated the surrounding air, rising to a deafening crescendo. Having successfully reached the stern, the 2 officers stared now in disbelief as an enormous dark shape started to rise up from the depths alongside them. Torrents of water flowed down the side of the craft as it came up out of the sea. It was like nothing that either man had seen before, too large to be a submarine, and yet too featureless to be any kind of surface vessel. As wide hatches on its side began to slide open, they saw more of the armoured attackers inside, readying what looked like huge cannons within the apertures. A loud cry from the opposite side of the ship caused Lennox to turn to face the Warsaw, where he saw Shepherd and the remnants of the boarding party watching. With a heavy heart, the Scotsman realised what needed to be done and bent down to remove the wooden panelling from the Fairley mortars. As the last of the ship's guns fell silent behind him, its operator writhing in agony, Lennox readied the mortars and rose back to his feet. He looked across at Kohler, who gave a grim smile in return and informed him it would be an honour to fight alongside him. A moment later, the charges at the base of the mortars ignited, saturating the night sky with explosive projectiles. At the point the mortar shells reached their maximum height and began their murderous descent back down to earth, Lennox dropped the grenade he had been holding into the mortar's ammunition crate. He turned, raised his pistol, mirrored by Kohler, and the 2 officers opened fire on the armoured figures that were slowly advancing towards them. Shepherd and the others had watched on in horror as the crew of the Mendacious was systematically dispatched by the mysterious enemy attackers, until only Lennox and the German commander remained. The destroyer's hull was vibrating beneath their feet now, the air around them filled with a deep humming noise as a dark shape rose up from behind the Q-ship. There was a flash of light at the rear of Mendacious, with countless small black objects suddenly flying up into the sky. With sickening realization, the lieutenant knew what was happening and yelled at his men to seek cover. They turned to run back into the ship's interior, only to find their path blocked by a pair of spear-wielding warriors. In desperation, Shepard let out a cry of anger and ran at the attackers, emptying his magazine into one before physically barreling into the other, sending them both crashing down into a heap on the ground below. As he lay stunned on the cold, wet metal of the ship's deck, strong arms grabbed hold of the British officer, hauling him to his feet. He had a brief glimpse of two sailors, repeatedly kicking and bashing away at the stricken armoured diver, before the whole world seemed to turn upside down. There was a blinding flash of light, a burst of searing heat, and then only darkness. When his eyes opened moments later, Shepard found himself alone on the deck. He staggered to his feet, looking around in confusion, and realised that the mortally wounded warship was now quickly slipping under the waves beneath him. As he lurched drunkenly towards a nearby handrail, he scanned the vicinity in vain for any trace of Mendacious or the enemy submarine. But all that littered the seas where the two craft had once been was wreckage and bodies. By some miracle, the battered launch that had transported him from Mendacious across to the Warsaw was still afloat, despite being half flooded with seawater. Shepard was about to drop from the deck into the waters below when he caught sight of something lying nearby. It was one of the murderous enemy harpoons, still held in the discarded countlet that had once belonged to its owner. He quickly snatched up the weapon and then jumped from the dying warship into the seas, managing to swim across to the half-stricken boat. Hauling himself inside, he turned to see the Warsaw's superstructure disappear beneath the surface, leaving him all alone. For the next hour, the British officer rode from body to body in search of fellow survivors, but there were none. He alone had survived the confrontation. Shepard waited for what seemed a lifetime, with only his troubled thoughts for company, until a trawler which had witnessed the explosion arrived and took him aboard. After being questioned at length upon his return to shore, it was only the possession of the weapon, snatched from his mysterious foe, that saved Shepard from committal to an asylum. But in time, he would find himself with little time to reflect upon his fortunes, as a new posting would soon present itself, one alongside the very officers who had been sent to the location to question him only hours before.